Hey, friend, I'm really glad that you're here today. Today's episode feels a little uncomfortable, not awkward, just honest, I guess, in a way that is still new to me. As I've shared before, talking about my faith publicly is something that I'm still not quite comfortable with. And I had this thought the other day that shifted, I guess, the way that I've been thinking about something. And one of the blessings of having this platform is that I spend a lot more time self reflecting, problem solving, looking not just at what I think the issue might be, but what could potentially be going on under the surface that maybe I'm missing. Lately, I've been holding on to this question. Um, and it's something that I've just been debating back and forth over whether or not I want to talk about it on the pod or not. And I guess since I'm here in front of a microphone with notes in front of me, I made the decision to actually talk about it. So here's the question. What if the hard thing in our family isn't just about circumstances or emotions or even our relationships? What if more than anything else, this hard thing that we're facing, what if it's spiritual? And before you click away, stay with me for a second. I'm not here to dramatize pain or to spiritualize everything. I'm just asking, I guess, what if this is something that we should be considering more than we do when deciding how we're going to approach hard things that are happening with our kids? I know for some of us, language like spiritual battle can feel uncomfortable. It's a little too intense or a little too abstract or maybe even just a little too woo-woo. But I think that we can all agree that there is such thing as good and evil, right? That there are things in this world that feel light-filled and life-giving. There's people who, when we're around them, we just have a sense of peace or a sense of ease around them. There might be, situations that we find ourselves in that just naturally feel safe without us really understanding why. And that there's also things that feel dark and maybe even have like a feeling of destructiveness to them. There's people who we can get around and something just feels off about them. Situations that we might find ourselves in, and there's something inside us that wants to leave. It wants to get out of that place. Things that feel just a little too tense or a little too heavy. If you have parented a child through addiction, depression, um, relationships that were emotionally or physically abusive that seemed to have a stronghold on your kid, you don't need theology to know that this isn't just about opinions or choices. Sometimes it's heavier than that. And most parents, I think, can feel the difference, even if it's not something they've never really named out loud. Now, the Bible doesn't shy away from this topic at all, of course. The Bible shies away from very little, but it says things in Ephesians 6 like, we do not wrestle against flesh and blood. And then there's a passage in Second Corinthians that talks about how, for though we walk in flesh, we do not wage war according to the flesh, that the weapons that we fight with are not weapons of the world. On the contrary, they have divine power to demolish strongholds. That verse has a way of bringing me back to truth, especially when my emotions start to get really loud. And it helps reframe how I'm seeing a situation. Because if this is true, if we walk in the flesh, but we don't wage war according to the flesh, then I have to pause and ask myself a hard question. How have I been waging war? See, my default response in hard parenting moments is to fight what I can see, right? So I'm fighting the behavior, I'm fighting the choice, I'm fighting the outcomes that I don't like. But my eyes will never be able to reveal the full picture. And when I enter the situation trying to control everything that's happening on the surface, there's a good chance my efforts won't just be ineffective, they'll actually start costing me something. And I notice it in myself. I talk about it a lot, I'm sure, in these podcast episodes about how I notice in myself that bitterness starts to creep in, that impatience starts to grow inside me, even that resentment starts to build. I become more irritable with my child because of the choices they're making. And naturally, I start focusing on the gap, the distance between where they are and where I wish they were. If that gap is the only way that I'm looking at the situation, it doesn't just create tension, it creates distance emotionally, relationally, spiritually. And that distance leads to more isolation for them and for me, which makes me wonder, what if something bigger is happening here? What if part of the battle isn't just about behavior or decisions, but about what's quietly working to divide, discourage, and disconnect? Because anything that consistently moves us away from compassion, clarity, and connection deserves our attention, don't you think? 1 Peter 5:8 calls this darkness out specifically. It says, "Be alert and of sober mind. Your enemy, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion looking for someone to devour." I believe that scripture talks about an enemy not to scare us, but to remind us that not everything influencing us is immediately visible. To me, being sober minded and alert means noticing what's shaping my reactions before it shapes my relationships. Because when my child is struggling, the enemy doesn't just target them directly. All he needs to do is get me stuck in my feelings, buried in fear, isolated in pain, convinced that nothing will ever change. Because if I'm there, I'm facing darkness. And the farther that I walk into that tunnel, the darker it gets, and the farther away I am from my child. And honestly, I fall into this trap almost every single time it is set. I can get so distracted by the details of the struggle that I lose my ability to just stay connected in love. Do you get what I'm saying? I think it makes total sense. If there is a darkness that from time to time we find ourselves fighting against, wouldn't it make sense that the goal for that darkness would be to isolate each of us? Isolate my child to keep them stuck in their struggle. Isolate me to keep me stuck in my fear and lack of control. When I'm disconnected, I lose access to the places where light actually travels. I lose the ability to speak life into their world, not by fixing or lecturing, but just by being present. I'm not as steady, I'm not as patient, I'm not as grounded. And that matters because if I stay close, then I can offer a sense of calm where there's panic. I can reflect truth when the lies inside them start getting loud. If I'm close, I can remind them who they are when they forget, not by forcing change, not by having the perfect words, just by staying in relationship. And honestly, I think that's part of how God designed us as parents, to show up as a steady presence that reflects His care, even when we don't know what's going to happen next. So if that's true, if distance is one of the ways darkness does its work, then the alternative isn't to fight harder, it's to fight differently. For me, that's meant having to learn how to pull back when I feel that separation between us starting to roll in. to stop and think about what the enemy might stand to gain if I stay on the path I'm on, to consider what might change if I stop waging war with my fear, my emotions, or my need to control the outcome. Because if this really is a spiritual battle, then the goal isn't winning an argument or forcing change. The real goal is for me to stay anchored in truth, love, and connection. That's the real battle I need to fight. And here's what I've been starting to see, I guess, a little bit more clearly. The enemy gains ground when I'm stuck in my feelings, my pain, my fear, or the darkness of isolation. But when I turn around away from that darkness and I'm patient enough to wait, my eyes begin to adjust to the light, and God shows me the next step forward. Just enough light for the step I'm on. I think that's actually a title of a book. I should probably check that out sometime. When I first make that transition, it feels like I'm waiting forever for the light to shine on the next step. You find yourself having to sit on your hands to keep them from taking back the illusion of control. You're waiting for the light to move forward so you know where you're meant to go next. And waiting is so hard because the whole time the enemy is just whispering in your ear, "Okay, Lord, I'm watching. I'm ready when you are. I'm waiting, but a little impatiently, to be honest, so it would be great if we could move a little faster." But he won't be rushed. He moves at his own pace. He smiles lovingly at you. He shakes his head in amusement. I imagine him slowly sitting on the ground, crisscross applesauce, as he pats the ground beside him. "Have a seat," he says. "Let's talk. What's going on in your heart today? You're really scared. Tell me about it. This is so hard, Lord. I'm so scared and I'm trying to do the right thing, but it's so hard to know what it is. I just want to fix it so badly and nothing I do feels right." Over and over again, you meet him back at that step. At first, constantly, and then less often as you start to feel more settled into the process of waiting and not knowing. And then something really cool happens. While you're waiting on him, you start to look around a little differently. And you begin to notice small ways he's been working, things that you were too distracted to see before. And for once, you're still enough to actually notice them. That child of yours that you've been praying for years who has that stronghold they just can't seem to break free from? Well, over time, you start to notice how God places people in their life. Maybe someone at work they have a conversation with who understands recovery because they've walked it themselves. Or that child who's been struggling with anxiety and depression and hasn't been able to work for a long time. You begin to see how God quietly opens a door through a roommate, a connection, a conversation that eventually leads to opportunity. You start to notice small things. A friend who texts you a song one morning that's just enough to get you through a hard moment. The podcast episode you choose to play on your car ride home that helps you feel a little less alone. And slowly God begins to reveal himself in the middle of your everyday circumstances. And with that awareness comes a new kind of hope. Not all at once, not perfectly, but enough to remind you God is moving even when you're standing still. As we start to see that life and the hard things we are facing are more than just what our eyes can see and our ears can hear, we begin to adjust as we recognize the patterns. Maybe we don't panic quite as quickly. Maybe we don't spiral quite as deeply. Maybe we learn how to turn toward the light sooner. Not because the battle's gone, but because we know where refuge is. If you're still with me, thank you. I know I probably lost a few people along the way, and that's okay. I want to be honest, this episode stretched me a bit. Talking about my faith is really still new for me. And my intention here is never to convince anyone of a doctrine or to push a belief. I'm just sharing what I'm learning as I'm walking through the hard places of parenting, and I'm trusting that maybe some of it might land as a small seed for someone else. We're not called to convince everyone, we're called to plant seeds. The harvest isn't mine, the outcomes aren't yours, but maybe today the invitation is simple. What might change if you paid attention to what's pulling you towards fear and gently chose to stay rooted in truth and connection instead? I don't know, just something to sit with. Until next time, stay close to your people, to the light, and to what's true. I'm really grateful we get to walk this road together.